This past week, Jiri Prochazka vacated the UFC light heavyweight title after sustaining a shoulder injury. Prochazka was scheduled to defend his title at UFC 282 on December 10th versus former UFC light heavyweight champion Glover Teixeira. UFC president Dana White told Yahoo Sports, quote, "This is the worst shoulder injury the doctors have ever seen in UFC history. It's really fucking bad. His shoulder is very, very bad. He's going to have serious surgery that will require extensive rehab." Teixeira was offered a fight versus Magomed Ankalaev for the vacant title, but Teixeira refused to fight him on December 10th. Teixeira offered to fight Ankalaev at UFC 283 on January 21st. However, the UFC rebuffed that. Teixeira offered to fight Jan Blachowicz on December 10th, but that was denied as well. The UFC decided to go with Magomed Ankalaev versus Jan Blachowicz for the vacant light heavyweight title as their new main event. These two combatants were previously scheduled to fight that same night in the co-main event. Did the UFC handle this situation correctly? If not, how could they have done it better or more fairly given all those moving pieces? Lots to unpack here. Nolan, get things started.
Well, I think overall it was going to be a losing situation regardless of what happens. Anytime your main event falls out and you have to scramble and pick up the pieces, you're going to end up with something that's not ideal, right? But the issue that I have with the way that this whole thing played out was that, Ankalaev versus Teixeira, Ankalaev versus Blachowicz was not the only option that could have gone on here. I mean, Glover Teixeira versus Jan Blachowicz, a rematch. I think that in the eyes of the fans would be a bigger fight in terms of name recognition, in terms of just overall familiarity with the fans. Ankalaev is a great fighter. I think of the three, of him, Glover, and Jan, I think he is the best fighter of them all. But I also think that the UFC doesn't typically run that way. Oftentimes they put in the name recognition guys, the guys with the, that the fans are more familiar with. But this time they decided to not do that. They decided to kind of tell Glover that he had one option and that was it, or he could take the high road. And that's ultimately what he did. So it's unfortunate that a classy sportsman like Glover Teixeira kind of gets gets shafted, gets pushed to the side. We don't really know what's going to happen with him. How long is it going to be before he fights again? He's old. So I would like to see them have the two old guys fight in a rematch. I know maybe it's not the most thrilling matchup on paper, but I think either way here, you were going to end up with a main event that was not as thrilling as obviously Jiri versus Glover too.
Damn, he had to say he's old. I'm 10 years older than Glover Teixeira. Feeling like grandpa here. All right. Up next is Goes. Goes, do you share the same sentiment as Nolan and Alan G, who in the chat says Glover definitely got the short end of the stick here? The UFC screwed him over.
Man, that's tough. See, I don't know that he was completely screwed over, but he was definitely mistreated. You can't force a guy to fight, right? The offer was there. He didn't want it. I can't disagree with anything Glover said, though. He makes great points, and he's not a spring chicken. He's, not 25 years old anymore. All of these fights matter for him. So at the same time, the way the UFC runs their business. The way they react when you say no to them. It doesn't really go well for fighters when they do that. They tend to kind of put you off to the side. So if you're Glover Teixeira, you have to kind of assess where you're at in your career, how many more of these fights you have. But I'll tell you what, man. I don't mind that Glover fired back and said, I'm willing to do this. But the second the UFC said, we're not willing to do that, I think given his age and given the landscape of the division, things that have happened in the past, I think you take that fight, man, because there's just so many things that can happen. And there's so many challengers that are on their way up. Like Jamal Hill, he just got a great fight. What happens if he looks great? What if there's injuries? What if there's a draw? Like there's so many things that can happen. And all the while, Glover's getting older and older. So I think if I were him, I would have fired back the way he did. But at the end of the day, I think I probably would have taken that fight because Father Time is not on his side.
All right, Mike Bond. Well, do you agree with these fellas?
Yeah, I tend to agree, and kind of going off what Goes was saying there too about the queue for Glover. I mean, obviously Jiri is going to be getting the first shot against the winner of this, so he's going to have to wait behind that person as well. So it could be a pretty drawn out process here. And yeah, I mean, this was a difficult kind of situation. I know he wanted to move it to Brazil, as Nolan laid out. That wasn't really an option here. They need a main event for that UFC 282 card. They tried to get, another title fight, some other big fights on this card, and it didn't work out. Maybe that would have been a possibility if they had the cushion of another title fight or something like that. But look at that card. It's, kind of thin on the super elite names. You have Paddy Pimblett as your pay-per-view co-headliner now. He's obviously, got his own kind of rising star thing going on, but not enough to support a card on its own. So they had to make this move. I think Glover, as Goes kind of said, should have probably jumped on this opportunity. I mean, I know Ankalaev is like a tricky matchup for him. He was saying that he wanted more time to prepare, but it's kind of even on both sides, right? Like they were both training for this date. It's both a change of styles for them. If anything, Glover kind of had the upper hand there, and the fact that he was already training for 5 rounds, Ankalaev was training for 3 rounds. So this seemed like a pretty decent situation for him to jump into and try to capitalize here. If you wanted to do the Blachowicz fight, sure, I would have been fine with that as well. I do think Glover should have been involved here. He was given the opportunity, but he didn't like the circumstances. So I can see why he's bothered, but this is the way the sport goes, man. People get injured. You have to roll with the punches. We know the UFC train does not stop for anyone, especially in a circumstance like this. So he's definitely the odd man out, and it's unfortunate given where he's at in his career, but I understand on this one why the UFC had to play it out as they did.
Yeah, not to cut in line here, but just something to get off my chest. Mike, you just touched on it. I think the fact that this pay-per-view is not necessarily, it's deep. There's people on the prelims that shouldn't be on the prelims. Or like deep prelims. For sure. But overall, there's not many supporting acts to this card. And I think that's an issue here. When you have a pay-per-view that does not have those fights that if the main event falls out, you can even advertise a pay-per-view anymore. That's when you run into problems. I mean, look at it now. What happens if one of these guys goes down in the main event? What are they going to do? Is Patty going to headline? Like, there's really no supporting acts that you can look at on this pay-per-view card right now that could be an emergency situation. They would probably have to cancel the event at this point if something happened to the new main event. So I think that's a problem. And sometimes it just really seems like these pay-per-views are rushed, especially coming off the heels of a big one last month. I get it. There's a lot of moving parts. You can't have everything be perfect, but I think a little bit more depth on the main card would do them wonders,
Yeah. Mike, let me lean on you for this one. Should they have stripped him or asked him to vacate, or should he have vacated? Because it sounds like he was on board. He fought about 6 months ago. He also said, I'm going to get surgery and be back in 6 months, which I don't know if he should have said if it's one of those injuries that holds out fighters usually about a year, like it did with Dillashaw and a few other fighters, the torn labrum. Yeah. But what do you think, about that? Like the UFC jumps at the chance to do interim bouts. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would like to talk to Jiri personally about kind of how this all unfolded first before I give like my fully educated answer here. But it does kind of make sense, I guess. I mean, if he's saying he doesn't want to hold up the line and wants the division to roll on, other people to get their opportunities, this is kind of the rightful thing to do. He doesn't have to do it. I mean, the UFC could have forced his hand. I'm not sure what type of conversations ultimately went down. My only biggest concern here, this stuff, it sucks, yeah, but how much does it really matter at the end of the day? The big thing that matters to me in this circumstance is when Jiri comes back and he's fighting whoever wins this fight, assuming it lines up this way, assuming there's no delays in his recovery or setbacks or whatever the case may be. I hope he gets pay-per-view points and goes into that fight treated as he was the champion, because that is the biggest sacrifice he is making here. I know, he doesn't get to walk around with that belt or have the prestige anymore, but that's all things he can get back. He can't get back the payday of entering a UFC main event with the pay-per-view points as a champion. So I hope that's at least an agreement they came to, and I'd like to hear from him when he gets to speak on this a little bit more.